Hi everybody, very welcome to Mentour and yet another video podcast. As always, I hope you're doing absolutely fantastic. Today on the video, guys, we're going to be talking about aircraft speed restrictions. What happens if an aircraft exceeds its maximum speed, and can a pilot get a speeding ticket? Stay tuned.
Wind 31016, everyone right, put on. Third land 31 right. Delta 260. Yes, sir, dude.
This video is brought to you in cooperation with Skillshare. Now, Skillshare is an online learning community with more than 25,000 high-quality courses for you to enjoy. If your New Year's resolution was to increase an existing skill or even learn something new, well then I highly recommend that you use this link below. 501st of you who does that will get 2 months of Skillshare premium membership absolutely for free. Right, so today guys we're going to be talking about maximum speeds on aircraft, okay? This is a fascinating subject, so make sure that you stay tuned. There are different maximum speeds on an aircraft, okay? There are both the speeds that are imposed to us by air traffic control and by the airspace that you're flying in, but also there are actual structural limits. So when an aircraft is flying, at higher speeds, the quicker that you fly, the more drag is going to be inserted onto the airframe. And basically for the speed increase, the drag will increase with the square of the increase in speed. So this means that for a relatively small increase in speed and the higher speed envelope, you're going to get much more drag. So this means that the aircraft has a maximum structural speed, it has a maximum operating speed, and also a maximum operating Mach number. And we'll talk about those in a second. But when we are taking off and when we're landing, we are extending high lift devices on the wings. So flaps, we're also extending landing gear. And for every time that you extend something, you're basically putting more of the aircraft into the face of the ongoing wind. So the drag will increase. So this means that the more flaps you have out, the lower speed restriction you have. In the case of the Boeing 737 that I'm flying, when you have flaps 1 and 5 selected, it's a relatively small amount of flaps, well then you can fly as fast as 250 knots indicated. It's always indicated airspeed, okay? But as you're starting to increase the amount of flaps you have, so flaps 10, you can always fly about 210 knots. And then for the landing flaps 30, it's a maximum of 175 knots. And for flaps 40, it's only 162 knots. If you are on final, you have flaps 40 selected, and for some reason you get a gust of wind or something happens that makes you increase the speed above the maximum speed, well then the flap slat electronic unit, the FSEU, will automatically retract the flaps to the next lower flap step. So with flaps 40 it's going to go to flaps 30. And what that means for us is that we're no longer stabilized and we need to go around. Okay. You also have speed restrictions when it comes to landing gear extension and retraction. And quite funnily enough, you can extend the gear at a higher speed than you can retract it. And that has to do with the loads that are being imposed on the actual retraction mechanism. But what it means for us, operational wise, is that when we do our after takeoff checklist, in the 737NG, the landing gear level has 3 different positions. It has down, it has up, and it has off. Okay? When the landing gear is up, it means that hydraulic fluid is being continuously applied to keep the gear up, okay? But in fact, as the landing gear has been retracted, there is up locks that locks the gear into position. So there's no need for that hydraulic fluid to be continuously pressurizing. So in the after takeoff checks, the pilot monitoring will move the landing gear lever from up to off to take away the hydraulic pressure. The problem is though that if you're not careful when you do this, you might go past the off position and into the down position. And if you do that, the landing gear is going to extend. Now, this is fine, all right? It's not great, but it can happen. When you are doing the after takeoff checklist, the aircraft tends to be accelerating. We're accelerating up to 250 knots, which is, I'll get to in a second, the maximum speed below 10,000 feet. But since that happens, the pilot monitoring tend to get scared, right? Not scared, but you'll get a startle. And the backbone reaction is to then immediately put the gear up again. But you cannot do that, right? And that's because, as I said, the extension speed might be higher than the retraction speed. So if you inadvertently extend the gear, you have to chill, wait, check what the speed is, potentially take some thrust off to decelerate the airspeed back, and then once you're below the maximum retraction speed, you can select the gear up again. Okay, so once again, before you take any action in the flight deck, you have to chill and you have to think and you have to know what you're doing. So that's maximum speed. That's based on what kind of configuration you have. And when it comes to flaps, the barber's poles, as in the little red dots on the primary flight display, they will change to reflect what the maximum speed is. Not in the case of the landing gear, but with flaps. So when we have flaps 40 selected, it will mean we have red dots all the way down to 162 knots to make sure that we can see if we're overspeeding the flaps. And if we do, if we, for whatever reason, overspeed the flaps, well then, when we've landed, we need to tell engineering and they need to do an inspection of the flap mechanism and so on. There is loads of extra margins built into this, so in most cases there's never any problems, but it still needs to be checked to make sure that it's operating properly. Right. So that's flaps and gear speeds. Then you come to the actual structural speed. Okay, when an aircraft is designed, it's designed to be able to take a certain air load. If you exceed that air load, you might start to get structural problems with the aircraft. Just to give you an example, if you think about, going out with an umbrella when there's a rain shower, as long as it's only raining and it's not too windy, the umbrella will work perfectly. But if it starts to be windy, at some point the umbrella is going to fall up and you're going to start getting wet. And what's happened there is that the umbrella has exceeded its VD, the design velocity. Okay? Aircraft have these design speeds as well, and the aircraft manufacturers have done a lot of research, a lot of computer modeling in order to find what that design speed is. So when they found the design speed, the aircraft cannot fly quicker than this speed. Then they put a healthy margin and they put what's called the VMO, the maximum operating speed of the aircraft. So the VMO is the highest speed that we can operate the aircraft during normal circumstances. This means that if you're flying up to and including that speed, there's no risk at all for any damage to the aircraft. But if you start exceeding that speed, you might start infringing on the VD. Okay, and this is something that is done during flight testing. This is why the test pilots are being paid so much money, which I sincerely hope they are. So during flight testing, the test pilots will dress up in flight suits. They will have their helmets on and even parachutes when they do this specific test, and they will exceed the VMO. Right? Because they have to show to the authorities that the aircraft can be positively handled at a speed greater than VMO and within an inch of the VD, as in the design speed. The only way to do this is to put the aircraft into a dive. So VD is also often referred to as a dive speed. They will get the aircraft up to high altitude, get the aircraft into a dive. They will go past the VMO, they will go into what's called a clacker, overspeed warning, and they will do that up to a predetermined limit to make sure that the aircraft is both controllable. It might be shaking heavily at that point, but it should be controllable, and it also needs to be intact. It can't be losing parts. Okay, so they do this, they only do this once, and obviously the aircraft needs to then be checked properly after that, but at least they have then shown that the aircraft is certified to fly with beyond VMO and up to and almost including VD. Okay, and I think it is called VDF. That's the actual demonstrated speed that was done during flight testing. So If you go beyond that, if you go beyond the VD, then you might start losing part of the aircraft. They might start actually falling off because of the increase in air load. And also, you might get something called wing flutter. That's self-induced oscillations that might start happening on the wings, where an oscillation starts, and because of the oscillation itself, it starts increasing in frequency until it actually breaks the wing. This can happen on other things than wings as well. I think it was the Tacoma narrow straight bridge that failed because of fluttering, because of that self-induced oscillation that happened at certain wind speeds. There was also two famous accidents to two different Lockheed Electras back in 1959 and 1960 that happened due to wing fluttering. It's fascinating, you should check it out. Anyway, so that can all happen if you exceed your VMO. So we never, ever, ever do that. Now, there's also something called MMO, which is the critical Mach number. Okay, it's the maximum operating Mach number. And this is similar, but it's due to different effects. So you might have noticed if you've been flying flight simulators, for example, that when you start climbing to higher altitude, the Barber's poles on your primary flight displays, they start coming down. Okay, so in the case of the 737 at lower altitudes before 25,000 feet or so, we can fly all the way up to 340 knots, which is our VMO. But as we get above 26,000 feet, that maximum speed starts creeping down. And that's because the speed of sound is decreasing. And we can never fly closer to the speed of sound than our critical Mach number, or our maximum operating Mach number. In the case of the 737, that's Mach 0.81. Okay? So we can't fly quicker than that. And what happens if you do that then? Well, the problem with that is that when we're flying, when we are taking lift out of the wings, which we always are when we're flying, then the air that's moving over the wings are being accelerated over the wings to create that lift, partially. That wind that is moving over the wings, that is going to be in the transonic areas, in very, very close to the speed of sound. So if you're flying Mach 0.81, well then the wind that's going over the wings might be very close to Mach 1. If you go past that, well then you'll start to have supersonic airflow happening on parts of the wing. And when supersonic airflow happens, you will start to have compression of air molecules. So the air molecules, instead of kind of reacting to each other, flowing nicely past the wing, they will start banging into each other, and they will cause something called a shock wave. Now that shock wave will cause an immense amount of drag, and that happens on different parts of the aircraft which they're not designed to do, because you don't fly a supersonic airliner. Then you start to get Mach buffeting, shaking of the aircraft. You might start actually Mach stalling, part of the aircraft wing as well, and also you might get a very nasty thing called Mach tuck. Mach tuck is happening because when the shock wave starts forming, well then the center of pressure, as in where the lift is being exerted on the wing, starts moving back. Now the center of gravity is still in the same point, so if the center of pressure suddenly starts moving back, well then that will have a longer moment arm, and it will push more, which means that it will push the nose down. So you're in a high speed event, the nose suddenly starts dropping, and you might not have enough elevator authority to counteract that push. So now the aircraft is pitching down, it's increasing in speed, you're getting higher and higher on the speed, and you will close and you will pass the MMO and the VMO, you know. So this is why we never fly past the Mach number, the max operating Mach number. I hope that makes sense. Good. Now I've done a different episode that I've talked about this in the what happens if an aircraft climbs too high, the coffin corner. So if you're interested in that, check that out. But what about speed restriction posed by air traffic control? There's quite a few. First of all, you have to realize that we fly in different types of airspaces. So controlled airspace, that's airspace that air traffic control has radar coverage of. They can see everyone that's in there, and this tends to be close to very busy airports, or as you get into the control zone of an airport before we start our approach. Those are airspace Alpha, Bravo and Charlie, and to a certain extent Delta. In those airspaces, for IFR, instrument flights, which we in transport category aircraft tend to always fly, doesn't need to have any specific speed restriction. So in the other non-controlled airspaces below 10,000 feet, it's a mandatory airspeed restriction of 250 knots. But when we fly commercially, we always tend to reduce back to 250 knots or below anyway, because it gives us a little bit more time, it gives us more control over the energy of the aircraft, and also the lower speed we have, the more chance we have to actually see and judge other traffic. So even though there's no speed restriction theoretically imposed by air traffic control in controlled airspace for IFR flights, we tend to keep it below 250 knots anyway. And we only increase that if air traffic controls actually tells us to increase, because they need to fit us into a landing traffic pattern, for example. Now, air traffic control can impose speed restrictions themselves. They can tell us, Mentour 360, maintain speed 220 knots to avoid holding, for example. And when air traffic control gives us a speed, we have to comply with it. All right, that's mandatory. And they can monitor our speed through radar. There are also different parts of arrival routes. So when we fly into an airport, we're following something called a STAR, a standard arrival route. And the STAR will be constructed by different points that's based on either ground-based navigation aids, like little beacons that's standing on the ground, or RNAV points, which is area navigation points, which are GPS coordinates normally. Now, along that route, along the STAR route, there might be speed restrictions. So at a certain point, you need to be back to 250 knots, and then as you get closer, 220 knots. And that's for air traffic control to be able to, know what we will do as we're getting closer, so that they can judge how much separation there is between two given flights. Okay, those are also mandatory. Unless air traffic control lifts the restriction, telling us that there is no speed restriction, we have to comply with those. And if we don't, air traffic control will ask us what we're doing. Mentour 360, confirm you're maintaining 250 knots, and we will say, no, sorry, we will reduce it. And in that case, air traffic control is likely to write a report saying that on this date, on this time, Mentour 360 exceeded the speed restriction. Now, that will not impose a fine, but it will go to my company, Mentour 360, and they will send a note saying that, listen, you have to talk to your pilots, make sure that they're following the proper speed restrictions. If it causes an incident, if we, for example, have a resolution advisory, a near crash with another aircraft because we have not followed the speed restriction, well then, me as a pilot, since I have a license, the authorities, the aviation authorities can contact me, and in worst case scenario, actually remove my license. So these are rules of the air that have to be followed, and this is part of our IFR, our instrument flight training, to comply with these things. So what about speed restrictions on the ground then? Yes, they do exist as well. These speed restrictions tend to be company specific, but they're very similar from company to company. So in my company, for example, the maximum speed that we're allowed to taxi in a straight line away from the apron is 30 knots. If you are backtracking a runway, so if you're actually entering a runway to backtrack into takeoff position, we can accelerate to as high as 50 knots. And that's because the runway is much wider than a taxiway. It's also guaranteed to be free of other traffic. And we might have to get into takeoff position fairly quickly to allow someone who's on final to land. When we are turning corners, well then the maximum speed on the 737 is 10 knots. And the reason for that is because we're using the nose wheel to turn. Now the nose wheel is the smallest and most sensitive part of the landing gear. So if you are doing a large turn at high speed, it's going to put a lot of strain on the nose gear, and we don't want that. So we decelerate back to 10 knots, turn more than 45 degrees, turn it, and then you can accelerate if you need to again. On the aprons, well then you have a speed restriction generally of 15 knots. And that's because on the apron you might come across other traffic. There might be baggage carts driving around, there might be other aircraft pushing back. So we have to be a little bit careful with the speed. Now the speed restriction on the apron, that can be enforced by air traffic control. And what tends to happen is that the airport police, from time to another, they are standing out on the apron with a laser gun measuring the speed. So when they do that, if you are speeding, if you're caught speeding, they will actually issue a fine, and they will issue the fine to the airline. So the airline will get the fine, and in most cases they will just contact the captain saying that, listen, we've got this fine, you have exceeded the speed, please explain yourself. Now, if you're a serial offender, and this happens many, many times, I've actually heard rumors of that fine being passed on to the captain in question for him or her to pay themselves. So it just goes to say, once again, that you have to make sure that you keep the speed restrictions. They're there for a reason. Now, the other speed restrictions, the ones that are company specific, they can also be enforced by the company using something called a OFDM system, an operational flight data monitoring system, which is something that I'll talk about in a coming episode. Okay? Now, that's all I had about speed restrictions, guys. If you have questions about this, as always, get into the Mentour Aviation app chat and just tag @Mentour and ask me directly there. We can talk about anything that you want. I want to send a special thank you to the sponsors of this episode, which is Skillshare. Now, Skillshare is a fantastic, high-quality online learning community that has more than 25,000 courses in pretty much anything that you can imagine. If you want to improve on an existing skill, or maybe you want to learn something new now in the new year, well then, go in there, use this link here below. The 500 first of you who uses this link will get 2 months of premium membership absolutely for free. You can check out all of the courses that are there. And a course that I think that you guys would really enjoy is a course where you can follow an actual flight instructor that is showing, using Home Simulator, how to prepare for your PPL, how to read charts, how to read checklists, how to take off the aircraft, do some maneuvering in a maneuvering area, and also going into land. It's a really, really good course. I highly recommend that you check it out, or any of the other courses, like how to build a website or how to improve on your YouTube channel. Use the link here below. 500 first of you get 2 months completely for free. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Pachi! Tick on the gubben! Pachito! Pachito! Yeah.